Okay, hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's really a pleasure to have all of you joining us today. Thank you for coming into our IAS Educational Fund webinar entitled Addressing HIV in Indigenous Populations, Challenges, Progress, and Paths Forward. I'd like to introduce myself first. My name is Darrell. I'm an infectious diseases physician and a clinician scientist. I'm a gay man of Chinese descent, living on Canadian soil. The specific location is currently known as Toronto or Toronto. This is the traditional territory of many Indigenous peoples, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, and the Huron-Wendat people. I'm also a governing council member of the International AIDS Society, and a real pleasure for me to be your moderator today. Now, I was really looking forward to having my co-moderator, Morenike Ukpong from Nigeria, join us today. Unfortunately, due to a last-minute change, she was no longer able to be here. So you're stuck with just me, but she's with us in spirit, and she greatly regrets that she couldn't be with us today. Being that I am in Canada, I wanted to take a moment and just recognize the significance of this specific date that we're holding our webinar on. Those of you in Canada will know that this is our fifth annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. It's colloquially and originally known as something else, something called Orange Shirt Day. And for those of you outside the country, I wanted to just very, very briefly share with you what this day is about. Perhaps we'll hear more about it shortly. But this is a day whose history dates back to a young girl named Phyllis Jack Webstad, an Indigenous girl who many years ago was very much looking forward to her first day of school. And she tells the story of how she had, with her parents, gone and purchased a special shirt just for the very first day of school, was very excited to be embarking upon this new part of her life, and wore the shirt to school on the first day, only to have it very immediately taken from her. And it was something she was never given the chance to wear again. And although it's, in some senses, it sounds like a story just of a t-shirt, in fact, it's representative of so much more that was forcibly taken away from Indigenous people across Turtle Island through what was known as the residential school system in this country. And today, people wear this shirt, an orange shirt, to recognize the atrocities that were committed and whose enduring legacy lasts on in many inequities across this land, including through the HIV epidemic that we'll hear about. And I hope that you can all, if you haven't heard about this story before, learn a little bit more about it and learn about the many issues facing Indigenous people, and that non-Indigenous people have a real obligation, I think, to try to rectify and recognize in our daily lives. So thank you so much for joining us all today. I'm going to move to a little bit of housekeeping about the webinar today. Please note that our webinar includes interpretation into French, Portuguese, and Spanish. You can toggle this by selecting your preferred language in the bottom bar of your Zoom toolbar. You can see the icon circled there on your screen. There's a little globe icon, and you should be able to select your language there. And please note that our presenters will speak in a variety of languages today, so be ready to toggle that on and off if you are not fluent in those languages. There are also live captions available, so please keep that in mind. They have been generated through AI, so please forgive any inaccuracies. Now, we do have a large number of attendees today. We're thrilled to have you all with us, but because of your numbers, everybody is currently muted. After the presentations, there will be some time for a question and answer session. And if you'd like to participate in that, we would welcome that. We'll ask you to please send any questions that you may have for the various speakers, focusing on today's topics in the Q&A box, and you'll see that also on your Zoom toolbar. If your question is for a specific speaker, please indicate their name. If it's for anyone on the panel, you can indicate that as well, and we'll try to direct that to whoever would like to speak to it. You'll also notice that in the question and answer box, there is a little thumbs up symbol where you will have the option of endorsing or encouraging a question that you see that someone else has posed if you're interested in it also. If you click on that, that gives us some indication of the interest level within today's participants and will help us prioritize questions for discussion. Okay, the recording of today's session, the session is being recorded, and the slides of today's session will be available in the IAS Plus platform that we can share with you as well in the chat. And in case you're having any technical issues with your Zoom, I certainly was just a short time ago, you can find additional guidance provided in the chat box. Okay, so please send us any kind of technical Zoom-related questions that you might have in the chat function. Finally, in the chat box, we would love to know who you are and where you're from. If you're from somewhere on Turtle Island or elsewhere in the world, please indicate where you're located, the traditional territory that you're calling in from. We'd love to know just how diverse our participants are today and the geographic representation. We love seeing that interaction. And then before we move on, I also really want to thank our donors for today's session, which are Gilead Sciences and Gyvez Healthcare, which made today's session possible. So with all of that housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to share with you the objectives for today's session. So hopefully you know what you signed up for today. We're going to spend this time in this webinar exploring the global Indigenous experience and its intersections with HIV through a number of speakers and panelists you see listed on your screen right now, who will speak about a number of topics, including the increased HIV vulnerability, the integration of traditional and conventional medicine, some intersectionality issues related to the unique barriers faced by LGBTIQ plus Indigenous peoples, and some principles for inclusive Indigenous-led research. We're going to open also with a presentation on the shared histories and colonization facing Indigenous people around the planet. And our goal of the session is to inspire some culturally responsive solutions and strengthen Indigenous leadership in the HIV response around the world. So, as you can see on your screen, our speakers today include some really phenomenal humans. We have Trevor Stratton from Canada, Michelle Tobin from Australia, Roberto Orellana from the United States, Beth de Gyvez Gallegos from Mexico, and Randy Jackson from Canada. Thank you, all of you, for generously giving of your time and joining us today in the webinar. And thank you all for participating as participants in the webinar. So with that, I'll move to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Trevor Stratton, who is a member of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. He is an Indigenous Leadership Policy Manager at CAAN, which stands for Communities, Alliances, and Networks. And Trevor, we're delighted to have you join us to present about the global Indigenous experience. So Trevor, please take it away.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm just going to share my screen here so I can share my slides with everyone. So my name is Trevor Stratton, and I work for CAAN, Communities, Alliances, and Networks. We used to be called the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, CAAN, but we've recently expanded our mandate from HIV to sexually transmitted and bloodborne infections, and we've also added tuberculosis to that. I'm the Indigenous Leadership Policy Manager at CAAN, and from 2011 to 2023, I was the coordinator of the International Indigenous Working Group on HIV and AIDS on behalf of CAAN. I'm a citizen of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, My mother was born and raised here in the community where I have now built a house, and this is where I live now in a clearing in an oak forest. My father was English Canadian. I identify as Mississauga Anishinaabe. I've been living with HIV since 1990. It's been 35 years since my diagnosis, and I want to acknowledge the TRC Day, the Truth and Reconciliation Day here in Canada, which is actually a national holiday. So we're working on our days off, honoring the Indigenous peoples of the land. And I just wanted to honor my grandmother, who was Mohawk and went to the very first Indian residential school in Canada called the Mohawk Residential School, which was unaffectionately called the mush hole by the Mohawk children that went there, because that was what they were fed, oatmeal in the morning, which was tasteless, and it was like very mushy. Um, when our International Indigenous Working Group years ago, when we came together globally, well, the first question we had is, how can we define Indigenous peoples? And then we realized we don't have to define it. That work is already being done at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So the UN does not adopt one definition of Indigenous peoples, but they often refer to this language here, which I will repeat. Indigenous communities, peoples, and nations are those which, having historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of the societies now prevailing on those territories or parts of them. They form at present non-dominant sectors of society and are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and their ethnic identity as the basis of their continued existence as peoples in accordance with their own cultural patterns, social institutions, and legal system. So that's some of the definition. I'm not going to go into the entire definition. It's very long. But on an individual basis, an Indigenous person is one who belongs to these Indigenous populations through self-identification as Indigenous, which is the group consciousness, and is recognized and accepted by these populations as one of its members, which is acceptance by the group. This preserves for these communities the sovereign right and power to decide who belongs to them without external interference. So I'm going to move on to slide 2 here. For 3 decades, Indigenous peoples around the world, we've been on this path of leading toward this working group, which actually sort of phased out recently due to a lack of funding. Before IGWA, we call it IGWA, this International Working Group on HIV and AIDS, before it was formalized, Indigenous people were already organized and coming together at the International AIDS conferences, hosted by the IAS, International AIDS Society. In 2005, with the support of the Government of Canada, CAAN issued a call for representatives of Indigenous peoples around the world and created a planning committee for Indigenous peoples' engagement at the upcoming International AIDS Conference, affectionately known as AIDS 2006 in Toronto. But Indigenous people were already engaged before we came together formally. Individuals, of course, were attending the International AIDS Conference, including in 1989, which was the year before I was diagnosed with HIV. An organization called ACT UP and its Canadian counterparts, AIDS Action Now and Reaction SIDA, stormed the 5th International AIDS Conference in Montreal. Up until that day, the International AIDS Conference was a members-only event for the AIDS establishment, a chance for scientists to hobnob with their fellow wizards, and I'm quoting historically, while dispensing wisdom and press releases to beleaguered doctors and a fawning press. People living with HIV were presented mainly as abstractions, their lives reduced to statistics on spreadsheets, their needs and desires mere sidelights to the noble pursuit of science. Of course, they wished to make their presence more concrete. They were welcome to do so for a $500 registration fee. And then came Montreal. And this is quoting still. I'll never forget the sight of our ragtag group of 300 protesters brushing past the security guards in the lobby of the Palais de Congrès in the fleet of silence equals death posters gliding up the escalator to the opening ceremony through our chants, thundering through the cavernous hall. So there they were, they grabbed the microphone and declared that the conference was now open. And Indigenous people were there. Our colleague, Denise Lambert, who resides in Alberta, was there in 1989, as well as other Indigenous peoples protesting and storming the stage. And you can see here's some of our collective action over the years at international AIDS conferences sponsored by the International AIDS Society. I'm not going to go through them, but you can see we were at every one since 2006, 2008, and 2010, right through. This list ends at 2020, but we were also in Montreal in 2022, and we were in Munich, Germany in 2024. Back in 2006 was the very first time Indigenous people spoke up together, and we issued a public global statement called the Toronto Charter. And there's the logo we created for the very first pre-conference on HIV and AIDS, which came before the AIDS 2006 pre-conference. And that, of course, was in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of my people, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And we also occupied a space in the global village of the International AIDS Conference called the Indigenous Peoples Networking Zone, where we had 4 days of presentations and interactive sessions on research, leadership, and community engagement. We were in Mexico. This was the only one that I happened to miss in the last 20 years. I wasn't at this one, but I understand, in particular, our Indigenous Peoples Networking Zone got great attention, and it was a highlight of our International AIDS Conference. And here we are in Vienna at AIDS 2010. And we didn't have a space in the global village because, in Austria, we didn't have Indigenous people to partner with, local Indigenous peoples who make up, 80% of the local people. We highlight the culture and raise up our Indigenous partners. But what we did instead is we focused on planning for a strategic plan, a global strategic plan for Indigenous peoples and communities from 2011 to 2017. And we had a number of objectives, increasing the visibility and impact for Indigenous peoples, improving the meaningful inclusion and research policy and program development, working toward the accurate representation of Indigenous peoples and data, epidata, providing capacity building and development. And the fifth one was around promoting Indigenous specific approaches to the social determinants of health. The sixth one was around conducting sustainability planning. And part of that, those activities in objective number 6 was to develop this working group into an international NGO. So we had very lofty goals, very, very ambitious goals. Here we are in Washington, D.C. during AIDS 2012. This is the Indigenous Peoples Networking Zone, where we actually set up a teepee in the global village. This was our fourth pre-conference and the fourth time we were in the global village in our Indigenous Peoples Networking Zone. But the International AIDS Conference is not the only place where Indigenous people engage globally. We also attend each year the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. We often partner and put on side events for Indigenous peoples and HIV, and we deliver interventions on the floor of the Permanent Forum there. In, let's see, back in, geez, what year would this have been? 2002 or 2003, we submitted a joint intervention with the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. And we requested an expert group meeting at the United Nations for Indigenous peoples and sexual health and reproductive rights. And they actually did it. The next year, they put on an expert group meeting on sexual health and reproductive rights. And this generated a very fulsome report, which years later, in 2019, our organization picked up and developed a global research project, which was funded on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we developed Indigenous research teams in 7 countries, developing culturally appropriate toolkits for Indigenous women and girls for sexual and reproductive health and rights. And that project is still ongoing. And we're very thankful for that. And we expect quite an amazing outcome from that. We also engaged at the Joint United Nations Program on HIV and AIDS. I held a seat on behalf of our organization, CAAN, from 2016 to 2018. We held the North American seat on the UNAIDS Program Coordinating Board NGO delegation. We never really got any concerted actions from the United Nations for Indigenous peoples in HIV, or, targeted initiatives directed for Indigenous peoples or Indigenous specific programming. However, we believe we did a good job at raising the profile of Indigenous peoples in HIV and AIDS. We actually did create an NGO eventually, which it kind of fizzled out because we didn't get the funding and the kind of support that we were hoping for. But we haven't given up, and we continue to strive toward this. And that organization partnered with another UN agency, the International Labour Organization, on an income generation project. We worked with partners in Uganda for creating indigenous medicines and marketing in them and processing them so that they're properly inspected and safe for public consumption. And we also worked in Nepal, where they were working on woolen crafts and indigenous clothing. But over the last 30 years, it seems that Indigenous people were just scratching the surface. Now that we're in 2025, during the Global Fund's 8th replenishment, which is struggling, with the commitment from governments around the world to multilateral funding seems to be waning or getting less and less, to getting weaker and weaker. We hear the announcement that UNAIDS will be sunsetting or closing in 2026, and that the United Nations is reorganizing under the drastic cuts in funding. And yet Indigenous people have a lot more work to do. Just at the time when we're seeing this decline in support for United Nations, many United Nations agencies and bodies. But we continue to support the United Nations. We continue to ask for their strong support. We will be seeing you in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 2026 in July at the next International AIDS Conference, and also at our 11th International Indigenous Pre-Conference on HIV and AIDS. Thanks for listening, Darrell. Thank you very much.
Yourself and others have led over the years, and so thank you so much for intertwining it so nicely with the history of the IAS and pointing out how much work there still is to do ahead. We really appreciate your being here. So let me move on and introduce our next panelist. We've got a number of different panelists today who will answer to a number of different questions that we have prepared in advance on today's topic. And the first is Michelle Tobin. So Michelle is a Yorta Yorta woman and descendant of the stolen generations. She's dedicated her life to advocating for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living with HIV. Michelle, we're so glad to have you here with us. Thank you so much. And what we wanted to ask you to tell us about is what some of the current challenges might be faced by Indigenous people around the world that increase their exposure to acquiring HIV.
One of the main problems that we seem to face is the lack of communication that is accessible for all our Indigenous people, especially when it's culturally appropriate. We've found that a lot of resources and materials that have been developed over the years have been targeted to the non-Indigenous communities. And so when that's not been targeted to us, it's been very hard to understand and for us to disseminate, to the broader communities. And so it's really important that, when we have whatever resources are being developed in non-Indigenous communities, that a lot of those are working, but they're not so much working for us, and that's generally because the language is not appropriate for us, and that also comes down to funding, where there's not enough funding that's been delivered for Indigenous people to have access and to be able to develop their own resources. And I mean, as we saw with what Trevor has shown, there's within the AIDS conferences, and the Indigenous spaces that we've had there, we've been able to come together and be able to have a better understanding of what's happening around the world for our brothers and sisters, and be able to work together on utilising what tools are working in some countries and that are not so much working in others. And, and especially when we look at the messaging of U equals U. I was the part of the IAS conference when it was held here in Brisbane back in 2023, and I also participated in the protest that, instead of having the U equals U message, it was about saying zero risk, because that's what it is. If you're on treatment and when you're on treatment and you cannot transmit it to anybody else, that means there is zero risk. So it's easier to translate and, for people to understand that, better within our communities. Some of the other issues that we faced that I know that occurs around the world is the access to our specialists to deal with HIV, who also have an understanding when we see other healthcare professionals who deal with our other complex health issues, that because of aging, we seem to have a lot of other health issues that are occurring. And so it's really important that when we go to see our HIV specialists, that we're making sure that we're having that conversation of what we're discussing with our local healthcare professionals, such as our GPs, and making sure that they're working together to have a better understanding about co-infections and especially interactions of what's happening with HIV meds with other meds, such as steroid like puffer, Ventolin puffer things, because I know for myself that there's been a major issue that I had that I didn't realise. And so making sure that you're able to have those conversations, where not many people do get to have those conversations with their specialists and their GPs, and that's where patient-centred care comes into it, that it's about us. We need to make sure that our healthcare providers are listening to what is happening with our bodies. We know what's happening with our bodies. We know when the treatments are not working and when we've got severe side effects, but we need to make sure that they are being heard from us to our healthcare providers. I think another thing is that when it comes to the access to our healthcare providers, I know that here in Australia that we've had a very shortage of local GPs, especially within our Aboriginal medical services. And so it can take up to a month for you to be able to see or have access to a healthcare provider. And for many of them, they've either retired or they've moved on due to other reasons. And so that's been a burden on many of us and I assume that would be happening right around the world, that there is a burden that, when we can't get access to our S100 prescriber or our health HIV specialist, we wonder, what's going to happen and how are we going to have access. And like we know with PrEP aid, with what Trump is doing in America, that is impacting on everybody, and especially when it comes to like the PBS, the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. There's a lot of things that he's trying to put a dampener on the way that we deal with and have access to our treatment and our services, and and especially with these tariffs that he wants to bring in. But and I think the more we stand grounded to who we are and what we need and what we believe we should have access to, we need to stay on that path, and making sure that we are speaking to our, not only our fellow brothers and sisters from globally, but also speaking to politicians from around the world, within our jurisdictions, and letting them know that this is actually happening. And I mean, we've had talks about that we will eliminate HIV or eliminate new HIV infections by 2035. Now, for that may be the case, but it's also starting to show that a lot of funding is also starting to dwindle down because they believe that HIV is no longer a risk for many. And so we tend to disagree with that, because for Indigenous people, one new infection is one too many. And it's really important that, we keep banging on those doors and letting them know that we are still here. But it's also those 20% that may not know that they're living with HIV, who are undiagnosed, that we need to be still fighting for them as much as fighting for ourselves and making sure we've still got access to the right line of treatment, especially around injectables. Injectables are the new thing that are coming in. And, many of us are on 1 pill a day. Some are still taking, up to 4. But for the new regimes of the long-lasting injectables for PrEP and for antiretrovirals, that will be a game changer for many of us, because it will then, with that, will eliminate much of the stigma of carrying a pill bottle around. It will also bring limited access, that you will need access to see a healthcare provider or HIV specialist, because, you're only going every couple of months, but once the long-lastings come into place, they could be 6 months to 12 months, which is an absolute game changer for, many newly diagnosed, but also for our mob, who won't need to worry about missing of dose, not being able to get in to see a doctor. And I think that's really, really important, that, there's some of the things, especially the challenges that we've faced over the years. And I mean, the the international AIDS conferences have been, a great networking place for many of us to be able to come together and share the journeys and the stories that we have. And I too was diagnosed in 1990, alongside with Trevor. And so living with HIV for 35 years, I was only given 10 years to live back in 1990, and lost all my family due to stigma and discrimination and lack of understanding. I have 2 beautiful daughters, one who is 36 with 3 daughters, and the younger one is 31, and she has a daughter and 2 sons. And my younger daughter was born whilst I was negative. Whilst I was positive, sorry, and she's negative. And the reason for me going through with that pregnancy, it was because it was a 1 in 4 chance back in 1994 that she would have, may contract the virus, and I took that risk. Now, many of us mums, we don't know whether we could do that, and I think the treatment nowadays has enabled us to even follow through with those dreams of becoming mums, returning to the workplace. There's much things that we can now do that we couldn't necessarily do because of stigma. And yeah. Thank you.
Examples of how the importance of language, the importance of cultural appropriateness really has such an important role to play in addressing the needs of Indigenous people and addressing the HIV epidemic around the world. So thank you for those comments, Michelle. It's with pleasure that I would like to move on to our next panelist. So I'd like to now ask Roberto Orellana to join us. Roberto is Indigenous Maya-born and was raised in Guatemala. He's currently a professor of social work and global health at the University of Washington. And Roberto, just a moment ago, Michelle was speaking about cultural appropriateness. We all know that Indigenous people around the world have really rich histories of understandings and approaches to health and medicine. And the question I wanted to ask you is how you think traditional systems of knowledge and modern conventional biomedicine can be combined, and how can we have these systems coexist?
Thank you, Darrell, and thanks everyone for being here. It's an honor to share this space and time with everybody. I think what Michelle was saying it's very important to this next topic. I just want to remind everybody that we have approximately at least 500 million indigenous people around the world, everywhere, Europe, Africa, Asia, the Americas. And that we share some histories of colonization and invasion throughout the past few centuries. But nonetheless, this 500 million up to 600 million at least, we're still here, right? And we survived. And all these populations throughout history have had some form of healthcare. So I just bringing that up because sometimes we think about the idea of traditional healing systems or ancient healing systems are this old thing or this magical thing that happens with some indigenous groups, and no, we're just this large part of humanity in the world that have been able to come up with systems of healing and taking care of ourselves and our families and those in our community that have maintained humanity going for thousands of years. And so indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous ways of healings have been around for a long time, and they continue to be a big part of the healthcare system in many indigenous communities around the world. A few years ago, a couple of centuries ago, this idea of what we now have of modern medicine came about, and it's great too. Yeah, and we talked already about some of the newer antiretrovirals and injectables, the long-lasting. That's great, right? And once again, we humans created that. And so the idea of combining different systems of care and different systems of healing just seems to be the most logical thing to do, right? And sometimes we think, how do we do it? Or why is it so hard? But all we have to do is go to indigenous communities and see how it is implemented, right? Most people in many indigenous communities continue to go to traditional healers for their daily needs, for child and maternal health. And those are indigenous healing systems that are well and alive. And we in indigenous communities combine that with modern medicine. And if we need to take ibuprofen, we will take ibuprofen as well as other plants and other herbal medicines. And so the point here is that when we're looking at HIV, for example, we have now really excellent antiretroviral treatments. But we know that the barrier to access those is stigma, discrimination, racism in the healthcare system and other systems in society. And we know that in indigenous communities, our healthcare system is more holistic and is beyond the individual, but also looking at the community and the land where we live. And so not only for indigenous people, but if all of us in society work together to bring and combine, and we do that in many other. I mean, how many people in this call, or how many people do we know that do acupuncture, for example, right? That's an ancient healing treatment that many of us use today. And so there are many also indigenous and ancient ways of healing that we can bring now to our system of care and combine in order to deal with the complex problems that we now face in society. So if we all make an effort to bring this epistemic, this knowledge alliances, these ways of alliances between ways of healing, all of society can benefit beyond indigenous communities, right? And so I think in our work with indigenous communities around the globe, and I have worked with some of the organizations that Trevor was talking about, we continue to see that the major barriers are that is social isolation, is the stigma and discrimination that people receive. And that's something that if we bring traditional healing practice, traditional healers into the HIV care, into the HIV continuum of care, we can reduce that stigma and that discrimination for indigenous people and other vulnerable populations. And by reducing those barriers, then people will have more access to these life-saving medications. And so I really urge everyone to think about the many different ways that they already implementing ancient ways and traditional ways of healing in their own practice, the way they eat, the way they exercise, the way to think, how it's not a complex, or it's it's not a difficult concept to make those alliances in our lives with in regards to healing. And so I think what Michelle was saying and what Trevor was saying makes sense in regards to making sure that people receive the care in a culturally appropriate way. And I'll stop there and continue with the questions afterwards.
Approaches. So I'd now like to invite our next panelist to join us. So Beth Sua de Gyvez Gallegos belongs to the ancestral sexual diversity community Mushe, or Trans, in Zapotec, Mexico. She is the secretary of the Coalition of Indigenous Peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean, and it's wonderful to have you joining us here today, Beth. So, Beth, we're going to ask you a question that speaks to the issue of intersectionality, and I wonder whether you can tell us what are some of the unique challenges that LGBTIQ plus members of Indigenous communities might face in relation to HIV, and what are some of the strategies that you think we can deploy to effectively address those challenges?
Hola, buenos días, buenas
Hello,
noches.
good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am Beth Sua de Gyvez Gallegos. I'm a Zapotec Mushe from Mexico. We face three major barriers that we have to face in indigenous people and the sexual diversity community. The cultural barrier, colonization, and gender binarism, homophobia. Our culture has different cosmovision. The Western concept with the LGBTIQ plus is different from the ancestral words we use and we identify with within our communities throughout our Latin America. The loss of traditional cosmovision in terms of sexual orientation and sex identity as Pillan in Chile, Punas in Panama, Two Spirits in Canada, Mushes in Mexico. These cosmovision that would embrace ancestral sexual diversity are facing stigma and discrimination in our communities, generating conflict with sexual and cultural identity, family, community pressure, and the risk of being ousted from our communities. And this leads to forced exclusion, racism, racial discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, and HIV stigma. The acknowledgement of uses and habits and the loss of our indigenous land has had a great impact Structural barriers, lack of healthcare services go together hand in hand with untrained healthcare staff. There is no respect for these people, for people from the LGBTQ plus community. We need relevant and updated information about HIV in terms of prevention inputs available. All this information should be in our indigenous languages. The location of specialty clinics, if available, leave many indigenous people without their ARV treatment due to the lack of economic resources to access these services. And within this chaos, the community leaders are resisting, and we're getting organized. Those of us who do field work that is not seen by international organizations and that is not supported by them either, try to focus on HIV prevention, institutional barriers. Vulnerability is increasing in our communities due to discrimination because of sexual orientation or gender identity. Adding to that, we have vulnerability because of being part of an indigenous people, discrimination in healthcare services, lack of public policies, lack of visibility in statistics and epidemiological studies. There are no reports and no identity data reflecting gender identity. And this leads to a healthcare problem and to a human rights problem. What can we expect at the community level? We want to recover ancestral indigenous traditions. We need to train community indigenous leaders. LGBTIQ plus have to become agents of change. We need to use community education focused on our community languages. We need healthcare services, intercultural training, and training on sexual diversity for our healthcare staff. We need friendly healthcare services focused on human rights, comprehensive healthcare service, not only for HIV, but also mental health, public policies, intersectional approach in all HIV public policies using data collection. We need LGBTQ plus people participating in the design of focus programs for ancestral and cultural sexual diversity groups. We cannot fight HIV without approaching all the ways of racial discrimination. Intersectionality is not an alternative, it is a must. Solutions should not come only from the Western medical model. We have to recover and strengthen traditional medicine, our own traditions, and we need to accept and respect our peoples. We cannot have actions, life-saving actions that will not take into account our indigenous peoples. We have our living languages, and the dominant cultures are trying to silence us, and silence leads to death. And this is the case of our brothers and sisters in the South America, in Venezuela, Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil, in the border with Paraguay. There are indigenous peoples that are about to become extinct as a result of AIDS. Solutions have to be built together with indigenous communities. They do not have to be built for the indigenous communities. Our peoples have been left out for 40 years in the fight against AIDS. Today, the result of this is that there are indigenous peoples about to become extinct. Thank you very much.
For bringing that passion to our panel today. You spoke about the imperative of framing these issues as human rights issues, which I absolutely agree with, and I'm sure our other panel members and participants would agree with as well. So thank you for that response. We're going to switch back to English, so we'll give people a chance to toggle their interpretation channels. But our fourth and final panelist for today is Randy Jackson. So Randy is from the Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. He's an associate professor in the School of Social Work and the Department of Health, Aging and Society in the Faculty of Social Sciences at McMaster University here in Canada. And Randy, the question we wanted to pose to you is to tell us about what best practices could be used to ensure the meaningful integration of Indigenous people in research as it relates to HIV and other areas. Why is it important that we highlight Indigenous-led research in academic circles and conferences and journals? Randy, what would you say to that?
Yeah, best practices. I'm going to actually start by maybe turning that on its head a little bit, because it sort of suggests to me that we're looking for best practices in terms of integrating Indigenous peoples into HIV research or research just generally, right? And so integration in that system cannot mean inclusion into a system that has historically extracted from, erased, or pathologized Indigenous lives. True best practice begins with recognition that Indigenous peoples are not guests in research, but sovereign knowledge holders. Research must shift from studying Indigenous peoples to walking with them alongside communities, guided by this idea of relational accountability. So in Indigenous context, Indigenous knowledge is not a commodity to be extracted. It is relational. It lives in stories, ceremonies, network kingships, and the land itself. So to conduct research with Indigenous communities requires a commitment to those relationships, to ancestors who carry the knowledge forward, to communities who sustain it in the present, and to generations yet to come who will inherit its rich teachings. This is why best practices demand respect for cultural protocols, reciprocity, responsibility, and Indigenous data sovereignty. But equally important, and this is an idea that I've been exploring recently, is this idea of refusal. So refusal is not a rejection of research, it's an assertion of sovereignty. It resists that colonial logic that all knowledge should be made available for academic consumption. Sometimes refusal means a community decides a question is not theirs to answer. Sometimes it means sacred knowledge stays within ceremony and it doesn't land in publications or at conference presentations. To honor that refusal is to honor Indigenous governance and the protection of what remains whole. So in HIV research, Indigenous peoples are often painted through lenses of risk, deficit, and disease. And part of my work here is about centering Indigenous strengths in the context of challenges posed by STBBIs, including HIV. And I believe that the work that we've been doing at the Feast Center for Indigenous STBBI research is really about research that refuses to see Indigenous bodies as broken. It insists that sexuality is not only about risk, but it's also about our sovereignty, our joy, our intimacy, and our thriving. So at the Feast Center, we developed this theoretical framework, which we call Indigenous Sexual Futurisms, that looks back to the past, to teachings of balance, kingship, land-based practices that held sexuality as sacred. And we bring those teachings into the present, but transforming how we understand sexual health in communities today. And it dreams forward, where it imagines futures where Indigenous sexualities are all at once free from colonial stigma, where pleasure and intimacy are recognized as medicine, and where two-spirit and indigenous people stand at the center of thriving nations. In this HIV research, the futurist lens reframes what counts as evidence, not only viral suppression or service uptake, but it now centers thriving relationships, community resurgence, and cultural continuity. So this is why I think Indigenous-led research must be featured in academia, and I think Roberto also brought this forward as well, because it really does transform what counts as knowledge. Indigenous scholarship has the potential to teach us that research is not only something that's analytical, but it's also relational. It's not always about discovery, but it is also always about responsibility. It challenges those colonial logics that have long defined academia and insist on new horizons where knowledge can also be life-giving, can support thriving futures. So featuring Indigenous research is a matter of justice. Not for too long, Indigenous voices have been excluded or marginalized, and we heard some of the stories about that today, within scholarly spaces. So elevating Indigenous-led scholarship addresses this inequity while also enriching academic discourse with perspectives that are global in scope and deeply transformative in their method. So most importantly, I think Indigenous research opens these kinds of futures. Futures where HIV research does not begin and end with risk, but it begins with thriving. Futures where refusal is understood as a sovereign right. Futures where relationality is recognized as rigor. Future where Indigenous sexual futurisms guide us towards health not as survival, but as a sovereign joy and a flourishing environment. So this is not only why Indigenous peoples must be integrated into research, it is why Indigenous peoples must lead it. It is why academia, conferences, and journals must not only feature Indigenous research, but allow it to transform the very shape of research itself. Thanks very much.
No worries. Really appreciate your being here, and I think you spoke really eloquently about the importance of other ways of knowing, of understanding resistance or refusal as a form of data sovereignty. There's some comments in the chat that we've been monitoring, echoing the importance of those concepts, and clearly that had a lot of impact for our participants today. So thank you so much for that, Randy. We're now going to move to a question and answer period for all of our panelists. Thank you so much to those of you who have started to enter some of your questions into the Q&A box. We invite you to continue to do that. Please put them there as opposed to in the chat box, because it allows us to focus in on the questions that you'd like to have addressed. So we've got about 25 minutes or so to have an open discussion, and we invite all of our panelists to speak up and participate. I think what we'll do is we'll just move now to inviting all of our panelists to turn on their cameras so we can see all of your beautiful faces. Thank you. And again, invite everybody who has questions to please enter them into the Q&A box so that we can share them with everyone. And I'll do my best to address as many of the questions that have come in as possible. The first one I wanted to start with, I think, is something best posed to yourself, Roberto. We have a question from Fanyana Ngubane, in which we can see, in South Africa, there's a problem of fake traditional healers and herbalists, and their work affects the trust of people in traditional healers. However, there are people who still seek help from traditional healers, and this includes Indigenous people. So the question that was posed was, what strategies can one use to help Indigenous people to understand the threat posed by fake traditional healers or herbalists without being disrespectful towards them or their culture? How would you respond to that complicated situation, Roberto?
I'll start with the assumption that no, I will start with the knowledge and the trust and the confidence that I know that Indigenous people are. Once again, many of us are still here because of resilience and strength, and we are very intelligent. And so the idea that Indigenous people wouldn't be able to tell who's fake and who's not, I'll start with that usually is not the case. Many of us know our elders, the traditional healers in our communities are very well. We know the people. Many of them are the traditional doulas, midwives who gave birth to many people in the community. So most Indigenous people know their elders and the carriers of knowledge and healing practices. And the issue of what there's also fake nurses and fake psychologists. So it's a problem for all professions around the world. It's not specifically an issue for Indigenous peoples. What I will say to that is that the way that we can do that is simply promote more the work of our traditional healers, our elders, and our healing practice in our communities, and revitalize that knowledge and continue to promote it in our communities, and also as Randy was saying, also to integrate not integrate Indigenous knowledge into other healthcare systems, but we in our own practice can integrate some of that knowledge into our own practices as well. And simply, again, we are in a human endeavor in which we take the best tools we have available, and some of them come from many of our Indigenous toolboxes, and some of them come from the modern labs too. So let's use all the tools available to make a difference in our communities.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Roberto. I'd like to pose a question to actually any of our speakers and panelists who'd like to address it next. We've had a number of questions and comments in the chat in English and French and other languages that speak about the importance of stigma and self-stigma as well, and how this impacts really all people who I think are affected by the HIV epidemic, but can be particularly poignant for many Indigenous people who have faced the oppression of colonization and other forms of discrimination around the world. So I would invite all of our panelists. Would any of you like to speak to this really massive issue, but a critically important one that always comes up? What can we do to face the tremendous stigma and discrimination that affects Indigenous people in the struggles that are faced around the HIV epidemic, and what can we do to counteract this?
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Michelle.
Sure, go ahead,
I was
Michelle.
just going to say, yeah, self-stigma is something that many of us do to ourselves. And I think much of that is come from society, from the way we've been perceived. And it's also like we get so concerned about what other people think. And especially when we have families, we want to raise our children. We want to have loving partners who may be negative, and so we're really concerned about the impact of that. And I mean, I know I've lost a lot of friends due to the fact that they've been accepting of me, but they've also not been accepting when it comes to like when we're friends on social media that, and I've questioned them on why have you not wanted to share some of the HIV material that I've, been promoting. And it's been because they've been worried about what their friends have thought and how they would react knowing that they've got friends with someone who's HIV positive. but trying to get that message out around the U equals U, or the fact that we cannot transmit the virus to anybody because we're on treatment and we continue to take our treatment, which is really, really important message for us to get out to other people. But it's just the way we get treated by other people that causes ourself to us causes us to self stigmatize. So yeah. And I think the tools that we need to use is to be kind to kind to ourselves. We know we are like everybody else. We aren't like it used to be back in the 80s and 90s that, most people who had HIV were really withdrawn. They'd lost a lot of weight. Their mobility issues were really bad, didn't have great access to the latest treatments. So a lot of our friends and partners were dying early. And so there was also that burden of living with HIV where we were still here 35 years later, whereas some of our partners were gone within 4 years. So, yeah. And I think the way we've changed our mindset around like pill taking and carrying our pills to knowing what's in the future that can eliminate some of that stigma and discrimination.
If I can briefly, so remember that HIV does not discriminate, the virus, right? The virus can't see color or anything. In antiretroviral treatment, the medicine, this really good medicine we have now, also doesn't discriminate. It's just the medicine. So who's doing the stigma and the discrimination? Right? It's not HIV, it's not the meds. So why are people not going to the clinic? Because when they go to the clinic for this life-saving treatment, they're treated badly, right? They're discriminated against. They say, what are you doing here? And that's where the multiple stigmas come into play for being indigenous, for being poor, for being gay, for being this, for being all these marks that society had put on society and on people, right? And so once again, if we bring now what we are right now calling traditional ancient ways of healing, or traditional healers, who know who we are, who know who you are in the community, how's that health service going to be provided to you by that member of your community who knows you since you were a child, who knows your family, right? So one way that we can do is, now that we have those meds and we have HIV testing, is that we can just bring them to the community, right? And we kind of like we don't have to go to the Mother Western Clinic anymore. We can provide the service in the community. In Guatemala, there's more than 25,000 registered traditional healers. They can have a box of HIV testing and a box of antiretrovirals, and people will go to them. And we're going to avoid the discrimination and the racism that they will feel somewhere else. So that's one way of dealing with the stigma. So what we have to look at is who's providing the stigma and the discrimination, and that's when we can think of how do we deal with it. So let's put a name on it, and a space, and in a location of who's doing the discrimination, who's doing the stigma, and then we deal with them. Trevor, you want to say something?
Yeah, that's a really good way of looking at it, man. It's a pandemic. HIV is a pandemic. That already has a stigma to it. Oh my God, they're trying to put viruses in our body, the prevention, and they're trying to corral us all into this one place. And I'm not one of them. I'm not a sheep. I have my independent will. There's already a stigma. But also, these pandemics, these viruses and such, they take the path of least resistance. So in a sense, they kind of do discriminate. The communities that are already marginalized, they're the easiest paths for transmission, the easier paths. So we're already vulnerable due to, like let's talk about indigenous peoples. We tend to be at the margins of society, where our health is not as good because we've been denied access to our own healthcare systems. People who use drugs, sex workers, some of the main modes of transmission, men who have sex with men, people in prison, obviously, they're already discriminated and criminalized. So these are already groups that are discriminated against, criminalized, and it's those multiple intersections of stigma and discrimination which creates more vulnerability. And to speak to Roberto's point, indigenous peoples are the best people to serve indigenous and within that culture. But I would say people who use drugs are the best people to work with people who use drugs. Sex workers are the best people to be working with sex workers because they know how people roll. They know how people speak, where they go, how they think, what are their values, etc. So this is what I'm talking about, peers. When we engage our peers, people like us, to reach people like us, that's when we feel safe. I think that's generalizing what Roberto just said.
Thanks, Trevor. And Randy, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. I haven't actually heard, or at least not very often, how stigma is actually a product of the colonial system. And we as indigenous peoples know exactly what to do about that colonial system, right? After all, I mean, we survived 500 years of colonialism, right? Isn't the world even the least bit interested how we did that? So in the context of stigma, I mean, indigenous peoples living with HIV are also confronting that, right? And they're resisting. They're resisting by reframing HIV as part of broader struggles for health, dignity, and sovereignty. Two-spirit indigenous queer leadership, also reframing stigma, not around HIV, but around things like sexuality, gender identity, gender diversity, those kinds of things. And I think it's really important that we also look at the ways in which Indigenous people living with HIV resist stigma, right? And often I think it's not just through education that it's the wrong thing, but it's all through sovereignty. It's through this idea of collective care or relational care. And it's also grounded in a strength-based framework, which sort of gives this message that we are not defined by our HIV status, by stigma, or even colonial narratives. We are defined by our strengths, our cultures, and our ability to promote thriving futures. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Randy. Beth, did you want to add some comments? Just unmute yourself.
Yes, I would like to highlight what has just been said about working with peers and explain what has been done in the Tehuantepec Isthmus. We have peers who are leaders, male and female leaders in the LGBT group, and we work through peers and we work through a network. And this is an important tool for us, for the people who work fighting against HIV, so as to do away with stigma and discrimination, which are so strong, but also to provide emotional support so that we work with our populations and we know, as we say in Mexico, what tools we have to do our work in a better way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. I wanted to move quickly to a question that was actually submitted at the time of registration. So thanks to those of you who submitted questions at that time. It's perhaps a briefer one, but I think it's best addressed by Trevor. The question that came in was, is there an international network that brings together activists, researchers, and Indigenous people living with HIV worldwide? You spoke a little bit about this, and I wonder whether you could maybe specifically tell participants today, how they can get involved in UGA and other networks.
This is an interesting time indeed. For many years, since about 2011, the Government of Canada has supported our organization, CAAN, Communities, Alliances, and Networks, to act as the secretariat for the International Indigenous Working Group on HIV and AIDS. We call it IGWA. In Espanol, they call it GTIVS, GTIIVS. The funding for our hosting of the working group sunsetted in the year 2023, so just about a year and a half ago.
And since then, we've still been doing some things. We're still going to international AIDS conferences. We're still trying to engage with UN AIDS, but we just don't have the funding to be the host. From the beginning of the coming together of our international working group, the concept we agreed on is that the Secretariat would shift to different indigenous peoples from different countries as they were able to rake together the funding to be able to do this work, because we have to feed our families. We can't do it for free. It's very difficult to do global work for free because it takes a lot of tools, and these things take money, as IAS knows. It takes money to put on a webinar like this. It takes dedicated staff and commitment. So we don't have that now. And right now at CAAN, since we've expanded our mandate, we are now examining what would that look like? Where would the funding come from? We probably need to expand our mandate from HIV to viral hepatitis, to tuberculosis, to some of the other diseases where we could use the pathways and that trust and rapport that needs to be built within indigenous communities anywhere where they exist, rather than having one boat go up the river or into the desert for HIV, the next one for tuberculosis, the next one for hepatitis. We have to rebuild the relationships and recreate that trust. One pathway, one collective group working on these very difficult to address issues in our indigenous communities, infectious diseases probably. That's what we're looking at examining now, but we were looking for the funding. As funding shrinks globally for these sorts of initiatives, in our 40 years of aspirations seem to be hanging on a hook, waiting for someone to come along with the tool or a vehicle for us to use to breathe new life into our global efforts. I hope that answers your question. I wish I had more hope in my answer.
Thank you so much, Trevor. We're running close to time, but there's some wonderful questions still coming in, so I'm going to try to move to them, and we'll try to see how many we can get through. I've got one I'd like to pose next to Randy, and then another I'll ask Beth and Michelle whether you can speak to. There's a question, Randy, in the chat that was addressed to all the panelists, but I'll ask it to you from Francisco Olivares, who says in Spanish that, in Chile, the example that the participant gives, the Ministry of Health says that 1 or 2% of HIV cases only are indigenous people, and that this is really due to gross underreporting in health centers, and that lack of accurate epidemiologic data makes it really challenging to finance a proper, informed response to the HIV epidemic. The questioner raises other methods for obtaining information about indigeneity, I think, with reference to an example from Chile. A Chilean anthropologist is given as an example. But I think the broader question really, Randy, is, what can we do about this kind of racism in epidemiology?
Wow. What can we do? Yeah, that's a huge question with not a very easy answer. Because ultimately what gets counted is really what matters to people. And if you're not being counted in those surveillance systems, then clearly, one isn't of concern to policymakers who need that information to design and deliver services, and the whole range of things that link to the need for better surveillance systems. And other than doing it yourself, which I don't even think is possible, I think that we just have to continually mount pressure on those in power who make these kinds of decisions that, yes, it does matter. It matters a great deal to a great number of people. And we shouldn't walk away from it because it's hard to implement, or that it's hard to because it costs money. These things are just not reasonable kinds of responses to that in 2025. I'll end it there. Thanks.
May I briefly follow up in that, as with many other things, we have to do it ourselves. So we can wait I mean, it's the job of local ministries to do the surveillance in all the countries, but we in this group, we have conducted many epidemiological surveys in Guatemala, Peru, and other places in order to have some epidemiological data ourselves, which is available, by the way, if anybody wants to reach out to me. But since this is an IAS webinar and the conference is coming, I really urge the society and everybody here to also send abstracts and presentation to the conference. The mid-year conference was in Peru last year. It was like 3-4 days in Peru. Peru is a country of approximately 50% of the population are indigenous. It's like 40 something, right? But they're also undercounted. And there were like 2 presentations in 4 days. How is that? How is that? We are the International AIDS Society, and we're going to go to Brazil, also next to Bolivia, 60% indigenous people. Peru, Guatemala. Well, it's one of the continents with the most indigenous people. How many presentations are we going to have? So if we don't even talk about it in our AIDS conference, why would the government say this is important? Why should we do surveillance? So I really recommend, I really suggest the man of IAS to really push for more indigenous related health promotion and research at AIDS, especially in Brazil. And otherwise, we are made invisible by governments, by ministries of health, and then by our very own conference. Why is that?
Thank you so much, Roberto. We're getting close to time, but I wanted to finish with one last question. And Michelle and Beth, I wonder whether you can speak to the important questions posed by Ana Carolina Porto, who is writing from Brazil and asks about reaching indigenous and communities that are far from urban centers that can take many hours, for example, to reach by boat, many of them lacking electricity and internet, and therefore also lacking health services and information. So there's significant challenges there in prevention, early diagnosis and treatment for HIV. How do you suggest approaching health education for remote communities in Brazil, elsewhere in the world, many of which are, of course, indigenous? If you could briefly respond to that, that would be great. Michelle, Beth.
Una de las formas más fáciles que se puede llegar a trabajar.
One of the easiest ways to work with remote communities is to locate female and male community leaders, train them so that they can do peer work within their communities. Access to technology, access to information for remote indigenous peoples is very difficult.
Es mucho más difícil para realizar.
More difficult to reach those communities when you do not use the right language. So we have to take into account the cosmovision of indigenous people using the right language for every people, whatever the language is, so that we can do our work. Information has to be provided in the right language so that it will reach the communities.
Thank you, Beth. Michelle, any comments?
Yeah, no, I agree with Beth. It is about language because even in Australia, we have amongst our Aboriginal people, there's many different languages right across the country. So, and they're not necessarily translated into English. But one of the things that we found, and especially within PATSIN, was working with our sexual health clinics that actually go out to the regional remote areas. And then they come back and let us know that that they've come across someone who's HIV and then they need to speak to an Indigenous positive person. So then we have a one-on-one phone contact, and that phone contact can last for an hour, or even longer. And we keep up those phone calls. One thing that we've wanted to really do is go out and do like a roadshow into our regional and remote communities by talking about not just HIV, but STIs as an overall. And so giving the community a bit of an understanding around STIs and HIV and viral hepatitis, but also letting them know that the importance of what their role is about empathy, compassion, supporting your family. Because many of our brothers and sisters who come from the LGBTIQ sister girl, brother boy communities have left their communities and their homes because they've been shunned because of their sexual identity. And then when HIV is brought into it, they're totally shunned even more so. And so they've moved to the cities where they're accepted for who they are, and it's better access to the services and, to get treatment. And we have, it's one of the main things that we sort of talk about when we go to government, that it's important to note that, HIV is affecting all of our communities, not just the gay white communities, that we know everywhere, that these are reaching, the far and beyond remote communities that our information is not reaching either. And, so it's really important for that. But it's also important for them to see a face of someone who's living with HIV. So then they don't perceive, that someone who looks like this or that, that we are real normal people. You can't see HIV. And as I said, I think Roberto said earlier, that HIV doesn't discriminate, it's people do. And that's what we've had to deal with, and to change their mindset so they're not discriminating against their loved ones. And we know by certain conversations, when someone brings up something derogatory or whatever around HIV/AIDS, then we're bang on that door and explaining it to them that that's not the way you talk about that. This is the way to talk about it. And even my children speak of it like that as well. When they hear that someone is speaking out of line or out of context, they are correcting them in the way it needs to be spoken about.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for those final comments. I'm afraid, everybody, that we've run out of time. As always, there were so many interesting questions that we just couldn't incorporate into the session today. But please feel free to continue to share your thoughts about what future sessions from the IES should look like. But for now, I'd like to give my really genuine warm thanks to all of our speakers and panelists. So Trevor, Michelle, Roberto, Beth, and Randy, wonderful words. Thank you so much for your wisdom, and I know I've learned so much from all of you today. I also want to thank all of our interpreters. Wonderful to make this more accessible to more people through that mechanism. And most of all, our participants. Without you, we would not have no webinar to put on at all. So thank you all. We spoke about such important strategies for addressing the challenges faced by Indigenous people around the world. I'll just highlight a handful, the importance of cultural appropriateness, the importance of thinking very carefully about the language that we use, intersectional approaches, data sovereignty, and I really love the framing of our strategy for addressing HIV in Indigenous communities as one based on thriving. So to all of you, thank you so much for joining us today.